I need to tell you something before I tell you anything else. There is a version of this story I have told many times. At church suppers, when I was still inside the community, to my mother in careful, sideways language. To the therapist I finally found at 31, who sat in a blue chair across from me and waited while I figured out how to say things I had never said aloud. And then there is this version, the true one, the one that begins not at the wedding, not at the moment I put on my blue dress and walked into a room full of people who believed they were witnessing something sacred. It begins later, much later that same night, in a small upstairs bedroom with a kerosene lamp and a man I barely knew and one sentence I was not expecting. A sentence so quiet it almost did not reach me. A sentence that changed everything I believed about my marriage, about my community, and about what two people can build when the world outside the door has already decided their fate. I am going to tell you what he said, but first you need to understand what I walked into that bedroom carrying, because without that weight, the words will not mean what they meant to me. Before we go any further, there is something I want to say from the heart. More than 90% of the people watching right now have not subscribed yet. And perhaps that would not matter so much if these stories were just words. But they are not. They are pieces of truth, pieces of lives shaped in silence that are only now finding their way into the open air. So if you have found something here that felt honest, that felt like a voice you needed to hear, please take one moment to subscribe. It is completely free and it helps these stories continue reaching the people who need them most. And while you are here, tell me in the comments, have you ever had one conversation that quietly rearranged everything you thought you knew? I would love to read what you share. I was 17 years old when the marriage was arranged, not suggested, not proposed, arranged, in the way that arrangements happen inside a plain community, which is to say that the men who mattered spoke to each other, a suitability was determined, and by the time I heard my own name spoken in connection with his, the shape of my future had already been decided in a room I was never invited to enter. His name was Eli. I knew him the way you know anyone in a small district, by sight, by family, by the rough outline of his daily life. He was 24. He had an uncle with a farm that needed managing, and a bishop who believed an unmarried man of that age was a problem waiting to grow larger. I was 17. I was the eldest daughter of a family that needed one less mouth moving toward adulthood. I am not saying this with bitterness. I am saying it because it is simply what was true. The engagement was announced on a Sunday. I learned about it the way you learn weather. It was simply the condition of the air that morning. I stood in my mother's kitchen with flour on my hands and heard my father's voice from the other room and understood before I even fully heard the words that something had been decided about me without me. Hold that feeling for a moment. That specific stillness, not shock exactly, more like the moment a door clicks shut behind you and you realize only then that you had been hoping, without knowing you were hoping, that it might stay open. My mother came to me later that afternoon. She stood at the sink and did not look at me directly and said it would pass. She meant the tightness in my chest that had not let go since morning. She meant the grief I was holding quietly because there was nowhere inside our life for it to be put down. It will pass, she said. And I believed her because she was my mother and because I did not know yet what I know now, that some things do not pass. Some things simply go quiet. They learn to live underneath the life you are building on top of them, and they wait there, patient as stones in a field, until the day you finally dig deep enough to find them. I want to stop here because I know what some of you are thinking. You are thinking about the part I have not told you yet. The sentence, the one Eli spoke in the lamplight while the house slept. I am going to get there, I promise. But that sentence only means what it means because of everything that came before it. Strip away the weight of those 4 months, and you have just words. With it, you have the thing that broke something open in me and put it back together differently. The wedding was in October, 280 people. The bishop preached on the duties of a wife, and I sat on a hard bench in my new blue dress with my hands folded and made my vows in a voice that did not shake because I had learned how to make my voice do what was required while the real part of me stood somewhere behind my eyes and watched. That is a skill plain girls learn young. Not something anyone teaches you. It arrives on its own, the way certain kinds of survival do, quietly, because the alternative is too costly. The meal came, the visiting, the singing. The long afternoon passed. My new mother-in-law embraced me and called me daughter. My father shook Eli's hand for a long time. The guests who had traveled far settled into the upstairs rooms because an Amish wedding does not end with the ceremony. We would stay another day, then spend weeks visiting relatives before finally moving to Eli's farm, which meant that when Eli and I climbed the narrow stairs to the small bedroom my mother had prepared, the house was full of people around us and below us and across the hall. The walls were thin, the floors announced every step. Eli closed the door. The kerosene lamp threw its warm circle onto the floorboards. He took off his black coat and hung it on the chair back. I sat down on the edge of the bed, still in my wedding dress, and felt the full weight of my 17 years pressing down on my chest. He sat beside me. The bed creaked. Somewhere below, a man laughed. Eli reached for my hand, and his hand was warm and rough from the fields, and he said, "Hannah, are you all right?" And that is when I broke. Not the soft, permitted kind of crying that older women had hinted a bride might feel. I cried the kind that comes from somewhere very old and very deep, the kind that does not stop when you press your hands to your face, the kind that has been building for months in a chest with nowhere to go. And Eli, this quiet man I had married 3 hours earlier, did not pull away. He did not grow cold. He did not tell me to collect myself. He sat beside me on that creaking bed, and he waited. Here is what I want you to understand about that waiting. In the world I had grown up in, a man waiting for a woman's grief to finish instead of silencing it was its own kind of act. It was not what I had been prepared for. And when I could finally speak, I said the only true thing I had said in 4 months. I said it in Pennsylvania Dutch because that was the only language my grief knew. I said, I did not want this. I did not want to marry you. I did not want to marry anyone yet. They did not ask me. I waited for him to be furious. I waited for him to go to my father, to name what I had just done as the faithlessness it would have been called in daylight. I sat in my wedding dress in that lamplight and waited for consequences I had been imagining for months. What he did instead is the reason I am still able to talk about that night. He was quiet for a long time. The lamp flickered, the house creaked around us, and then, very softly, he said, "I know." He said it again. "I know, Hannah. They did not ask me either." I looked at him then. Truly looked at him for the first time since the announcement, and what I saw in his face was something I could not have predicted. He was tired. He was frightened. He was 24 years old, and his uncle had pressed a farm into his hands and told him he needed a wife, and he had said yes because their parents had decided it was suitable. He had been hoping for 2 years to court a girl named Mary from a neighboring district, but her family had matched her with someone else, and the farm needed managing by spring, and he had done what was expected. He told me all of this in a low voice while laughter drifted up through the floorboards. He told me he had cried alone in the barn the week the engagement was announced. He told me he did not know how to be a husband to a woman he did not know. He had hoped I felt differently, but he had watched my face during the ceremony and suspected I felt exactly the same. I need you to stay with me here, because this is the part that is hardest to explain. What happened next had no name inside the world we both came from, no word for it in Pennsylvania Dutch, no model in any marriage I had ever observed. 2 people placed in a room neither of them had chosen, looking at each other across a creaking bed and deciding quietly to begin. We talked. That is all we did that night. We talked until the lamp burned low. We talked about the people we had wanted to marry. We talked about our fears, his fear that he would never love me, my fear that I would never love anyone after this. We talked about the farm and the children the community expected and the years stretching ahead. And then we made an agreement no bishop would have blessed. We agreed we would not be intimate that night. We agreed to lie down under my grandmother's quilt, fully clothed with space between us, and to try first to become friends. That, if friendship grew, we would let the rest follow when it was ready, in its own time. We agreed what happened inside our bedroom was ours alone. I lay awake most of that night, listening to his breathing beside me. This man I did not know but had promised my life to, and somewhere inside the strangeness of it, I felt something I had not expected. Not love, it was far too early, something quieter, the first small edge of trust. The understanding that I was not entirely alone inside what had been done to us. We stayed married for almost 6 years. That is the part that surprises people most. But something grew in those years that I have never found the right word for. Not the love the songs describe, not the sweeping thing I read about later in English novels, but it was real. We became friends. We became partners. He learned I needed an hour alone in the garden every morning to feel like myself. I learned he was still grieving the girl he had not been allowed to marry. We talked in the evenings about things our parents had never talked about with each other. We were intimate eventually, but only months later, on a night that felt like ours and not the community's. I think of my friend Rebecca sometimes. She married the same year I did. She told me once while we were canning peaches that after 4 years, she still could not stand the smell of her husband's hair oil. She said it the way you mention weather. I held her hand and said nothing. She did not have what I had stumbled into. Most girls did not. What Eli and I found was rare, and the system that had placed us in that room together had not earned the credit for it. We had stolen it from the system in whispers, in lamplight, while the house slept. When I left the community at 23, Eli drove me to the bus station in the dark. He had known for almost a year that I needed to go. We had talked about it in our quiet way, the way we learned on that wedding night. He cried when he hugged me goodbye. I cried too. The shunning that followed, the unanswered letters, the closed doors of my parents and siblings, all of that I have spoken about elsewhere. But Eli never fully shunned me. Twice a year, a card would arrive. No return address. Just my name in his careful handwriting, as if saying my name was the thing he could still do. He died 3 years ago in a farming accident. I learned from an English neighbor who had found my number. I cried for a week. Not because I had been in love with him the way English people mean love, but because he had been the only person in that entire world who had ever asked me how I truly felt and stayed still long enough to hear the real answer. In therapy, I learned a phrase I had never heard before. Coercive consent. It means consent that is technically given but cannot be meaningfully refused because the cost of refusal is everything. My consent at 17 was coercive. My vows in front of those 280 people were coercive. Not one part of it would have survived a single honest question. And yet all of it was sanctified as the will of God. What Eli and I built afterward, the friendship, the quiet agreement, the slow trust that grew between two people placed together without asking, that was the part that was real. The system did not give us that. We made it ourselves, with no map and no permission, in whispers in a lamplit room while the house slept. If you grew up in a place where your future was decided in conversations you were not invited to, I see you. If you ever stood somewhere with your hands full of ordinary work while the rest of your life was being arranged in the next room, I see you. If you ever lay beside a stranger you had promised your life to and wondered whether anyone would ever ask how you truly felt, I see you. You were not weak for the grief you carried. You were not faithless for wanting more. You were a young person asked to carry something far too heavy for the age you were. I cannot give you back the years. I cannot undo the choices made for you before you were old enough to make them yourself, but I can tell you this. The voice inside you that whispered, "I did not want this," that voice was not sin. That voice was not weakness. That voice was the truest thing in the room. Listen to it now, even if you could not listen to it then. Before you go, I want to thank you for staying with me until the very end. I know there are countless things you could have given your attention to today, and you chose to spend this time here. But I noticed something, and I want to be honest with you about it. More than 90% of the people who watch these stories still have not subscribed. And if this one moved you, if that sentence Eli spoke in the lamplight stayed with you, or if something Hannah carried felt familiar in a way you were not expecting, I hope you will subscribe before you leave. It is free. And it is how these stories keep finding the people who need them. And before you go, tell me in the comments what part of this story stayed with you the longest. Or if you are not ready to share your own, just tell me you were here, that you listened. That is enough. The life that was chosen for you is not the only life you are allowed to want.